Welcome back to Film Lovers.
I'm Tim Schumacher.
And I'm Shannon Fletcher. We are lovers of film.
And lovers of each other.
And lovers of each other. This week we watched I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which was oddly a good film for the week. This was Thanksgiving week. That's part of why I think we waited a couple weeks to put out another one of these. It's just a very busy time of year, the holiday season, and it was a weird one too with like quarantine. I got tested to go back to my parents' house. Not that they like wouldn't let me back there without the test. It was just like, yeah, I feel like I should do this. Like cases are way through the roof in Minnesota. And yeah, it was a tense holiday, I bet, in lots of homes.
Lots of homes, yeah. And this movie is totally about like that experience. Yeah. Like it's a very tense homecoming. The synopsis of this film is from Google. It's like one sentence, very, very brief, which I think is appropriate for this movie. Full of misgivings, a young woman travels with her new boyfriend to his parents' secluded farm. That's really all you need to know about the movie going into it. I intentionally avoided knowing as much about this movie as possible before I went into it. And that was tough because this movie came out a few months ago on Netflix. And when it came out, it's a Charlie Kaufman movie. A lot of people were talking about it, and I wanted to avoid knowing as much as possible. And I would recommend that. I would totally recommend that. Yeah. Is what I'm saying. Yeah. And
a big disclaimer for this podcast: if you haven't seen I'm Thinking of Ending Things, like just don't listen to this. Like I would not recommend.
See the movie first, and then listen to us afterwards, because there's a lot. I think it'll be more rewarding to go into the movie with kind of a blank mind and not know what to expect.
There's just no way to talk about this movie without giving hella spoilers. The entire thing is kind of a spoiler. Yeah, and we can't talk about it without doing that. So that's just the big disclaimer. Like, if you haven't seen the movie, skip this podcast.
Another disclaimer is that when we started this podcast, we also set out to have movies that were picked by either myself or by Shannon. And we wanted that format because we often don't agree on movies. Maybe 60% of the time we do agree, but there's a big chunk of the time where I've liked a movie that you didn't like, or that you've liked a movie that I didn't like. And now we're 2 weeks in a row where we both like the movie. We agree on this one, yeah. We're already kind of destroying the premise of this podcast by having the same opinion on the movie. So with that out of the way, let's get to our hot takes of the movie before we start diving into it. Do you have a hot take on this movie, Shannon?
Yeah, we looked up. I totally agree with the Rotten Tomatoes. The Rotten Tomatoes scores are, I think the audience score for this movie is at 47. And the critic score is around like 86 or something when we checked today. And that's kind of how I feel about this film too. It is not an enjoyable watch. It's incredibly disorienting. The narrator isn't just unreliable, but isn't real. Like, we'll get into it later, but the narrator doesn't exist. Like,
depends
there
on
isn't a human being narrating this film. I have a theory, and I'm happy to share it later. But yeah, it's just it's a tough watch. Don't watch this when you're really tired. You want to pay attention. It's a bit of a thinker. It's a Charlie Kaufman film. They're all quite meta. He's someone who thinks about scripts and thinks about movies a lot, and wants you to as well when you're watching one of his films. So yeah, it's definitely not for everyone, but if you take the time to sit down, watch this movie, think about the different symbols and like the just fucked up narrative choices that were made, it is super valuable. And it's totally, you'll have a discussion about it with your partner too, I imagine, if you watch it with someone. It's cool. It is cool. It's a cool idea. Charlie Kaufman's movies are always kind of snow globes. Like, they're really great from the outside in. Like, it's just a cool idea. It's a great concept. Don't want to live there. I don't want to live in a snow globe, right? Like, nobody wants to, because it's maddening and it's a tiny fishbowl. But they're very cool little experiments that he designs and shakes up.
I think experiment is a good way to describe this movie, because it really does make some interesting choices with narrative linearity that do make it, they kind of obfuscate the ability to understand the movie, but they also make it more interesting and diving into that. My hot take personally is that this plot centers around a couple driving through a snowstorm to go to a remote farmhouse in a state that we're never really told, but it's clearly a cold state. It's rural Minnesota or South Dakota or Wisconsin. It's just so remote and bleak in the beginning. And honestly,
it could be Nebraska.
It could be Nebraska. But my point being that, it's this couple driving through a bleak landscape to go to a home where a man with the couple that are supposed to be Jake's parents are a man with kind of an inexplicable British accent and Toni Collette. So I'm calling, my hot take is that this movie
man is famous too. David Thewlis. I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
I'm just
famous actor.
I'm just saying my hot take is that this movie takes place in the Hereditary universe. That is your hot take. That's my hot take. My secondary hot take, which is a response to your hot take, is that the narrator is real and that it is Jake in the future losing his mind. And this is where we get into spoiler territory. I think losing his mind is too vague a description of it. I think he's literally dealing with dementia. I think he's dealing with dementia and not an unsatisfied.
Okay, I have a theory as well.
Okay.
What is so DMT is a drug.
Yes.
And it mimics one of the hormones that floods your brain
when you're
dying.
Yes.
Do you remember what that hormone is called?
It's called DMT. It's just called DMT. It's a tryptamine that your body produces.
I think the narrator of the film is the DMT running through Jake's brain right before he dies.
So you think this movie is occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, where this is just like he's literally dying like in the span of like 5 minutes. In the movie that we see, the 2 hours and 10 minutes that we see is what's going through his mind as he's dying. Yeah, I can see that, and I'm kind of in the same boat of that.
There's a lot of dream-like things, something about me is I dream a lot. I have been like lucid dreaming since I was a child.
Pro dreamer. She dreams every single night. I often don't remember my dreams because
I often do.
Yes.
So like, I think Charlie Kaufman probably does too, because there's so many little things like, hey, that person had this person's face, but I knew in my heart that it was that person. Like the way that names and occupations and like faces get swapped around in a dream happens in this film. And the way that you can both remember your mother as like what she was like when you were a child and what she is like now. Even if she has dementia now and is a completely different person now, like you can kind of personalities collapse, like time collapses, and that's happening in this sort of this movie, this sequence as well, where you get these different glimpses of the parents at different parts of their points of the kind of Jake, this key character. I won't call him the main character because that is a traditional film trope that like we're not playing with in this movie really.
Very much ignores,
He is the key character, I'll say. And you see both of his parents at these weird, crazy different points in their lives, in like very different like archetypes that he has around them, like his mother as the like busybody housewife from like the 50s.
And when she says busybody housewife, she's literally wearing like a peach pressed uniform that like a maid
she looks like she belongs in a 1950s commercial.
Absolutely.
Part of this. So like there's like literal archetypes present in the people being depicted. And like that's so dreamy. Like a lot of dreamy things are going on. The dance, like to tell a story through dance is very dreamy. There's a long dance sequence with I'm sure tons of symbolism in it that you like don't totally process in real time because you're just trying to keep up. This movie is like we could watch it 8 times and pick up something new, I'm sure, each time we watch it, because it's chock full of like weird little symbols and puzzle pieces to this person's like psyche. I think there's a soul thing going on, like a subconscious. I think it's DMT, like telling a story of someone. Well,
and when we say DMT, we're not referring to like taking a drug, but like the process of dying. I think this movie has something in common with Enter the Void, which is about a guy dying and then like seeing the events immediately after his death unfold. And I think this just takes the opposite chronological approach to something like that, where it's a guy who is trying to remember the like post good times of his life, right? Because I want to back up and say that when you look this movie up on Wikipedia, it lists this movie as a psychological horror. And it does that because there is no good way to classify this movie in terms of genre. But I think the horror of trying to kind of claw back to a place in your life where you felt somewhat good about yourself and then failing to do even that is horrifying to anyone, not even just this main character. And to sum it up, this main character, the book is more explicit about this from what I've read online, but the main character that's played by Jake, and again, I keep saying main character, not totally true. It's really the brain that this story is centered on. This is a guy that dropped out of college and took a job as a janitor, and the time...
Does the book state whether or not this breakup had something to do with him dropping out of college?
No, and the book doesn't state that. And I think the point with that is that Jake is a reasonably intelligent but depressed individual who can't structure his life enough to get through college, but he spends so much time showing you how intelligent he is. He recites a Wordsworth poem from memory to his girlfriend, who is described as she's a grad student studying neurobiology. She's a grad student in linguistics. She's a grad student in something. We spend a lot of time in this movie with swapping out her academic profession, whatever she's specializing in, because Jake can't remember exactly what she did.
Right.
But he can remember trying to impress her by either, like, when he first picks her up from the school that she's working at, she's talking about the paper that she's writing on neurobiology in mice, I believe, like something about the basal ganglion of their brain. And he keeps up with her. He clearly is like reading parallel to what she's doing so that he can tell himself that he's as smart as his partner is, because he's aware that he's a college dropout and she's a professional academic right now, and she's not going to stay interested in him if he doesn't try and keep up.
Yeah, that information is definitely not present though in the movie. You don't know the status of Jake's enrollment or not enrollment.
Yeah, I mean, they never state that he dropped out of college, but what they do hint at is that his mom, Toni Collette, repeatedly says he's done so much despite being so limited. Like there's some suggestion that he has like some kind of brain condition that prevents him from being more successful. And they spend a lot of time establishing that he's a hard worker, but he's just not equipped to succeed the way that he wants to. And that is an immense source of dissatisfaction for him. That's what this movie is really about, I think, is dissatisfaction with the self. That this man knows that he's breathing his dying breaths right now on some level. And he's just trying to process a time in his life where he felt good or good about himself. And the closest thing he can come to is like right before his girlfriend at the time broke up with him. Like that's the closest he can come to because he's so dissatisfied with his life.
I have a slightly different theory. I really do think it's that the project of this film was Kaufman wanting to, I mean, we see this in movies where someone almost dies or someone maybe does die, and there's this little montage of like the highlight reel, right? Of your life and how it played out. You often see glowy, dreamy pictures of children and like childhood memories in these montages. And I think that the project of this film is to dissect that and say like, hell no, there is a montage, but it is very different. It is factually inaccurate, and it is a mixture of these pivotal moments in your life. I think that Jake, this key character, really finds that the breakup was clearly a pivotal moment. The visit to the parents was clearly a pivotal moment in his life, where like the fork in the road happens and like one timeline is happy maybe and one timeline isn't. But the fever dream of going over that, I think it's the highlight reel, and it's a lot less high, it's a lot less happy than the way film has shown it before. And I think that the key project of this film is to talk about what that might actually be like. If we're being real, you're not going to have a pleasant the final moments of your life will be a mixture of highs and lows. from your life.
And when you say factually inaccurate, how we know that it's factually inaccurate because he keeps getting certain. There's a lot of inconsistency in the movie. We'll see a scene, and then we'll see that scene like 2 minutes later, and the names are swapped. Lucy's doing something different, and his parents are saying things about him that are slightly off. So we're presented with like the fact that a lot of what he's remembering is factually inaccurate.
Yeah, it can't all be right.
Right.
So I think too, the phrase "I'm thinking about ending things," like that gets repeated. I think, does he ever say it? Does like the character or the actor who plays Jake ever say it?
I would go back through this movie to find out because I don't think he does. I don't think he ever does. It's mostly the girlfriend. I think we only ever hear "I'm thinking about ending things" from her, and I think that's because the conceit of the movie is that Jake is speaking through her. Right, like he's remembering,
or he's fixated on the memory of her saying that.
Yeah.
I can relate. Like I've had one really rough breakup that I did not see coming in my life, and then I was let go from a job once in a similar situation where I really wasn't seeing I did not see it coming. Both things were ultimately good, but both of those conversations started with a line, and I remember that line, and I recite that line to myself as sort of a automatic negative thought.
Yeah.
So like when I got let, like we're gonna have to let you go, or we're gonna let you go, like. I replay that memory of like this HR guy at my first job letting me go from my job over and over again, because it's this pivotal moment for me where the fork in the road happened in my life, which was going to go one way, goes another way. With the boyfriend, it was, I have bad news.
Yeah.
He said, I have bad news. Like his mom was in the hospital or something. And I remember like all the thoughts that went through my head of like, what bad news? Like, what could that be?
Right.
And then it was the breakup talk. And so I think I kind of relate to this idea of one sentence almost summarizing a terrible traumatic memory for you and being like the thing you replay in your brain over and over again, and it just gets like supplanted in your mind. And I betcha when I experience DMT before I die, maybe those lines get said again, because they are these forks in the road where I thought my life was going in one direction and then it went in another. So I kind of like the more she said that line, I was like, ugh, I've heard this line.
Yeah.
And I know exactly what's going on. They are going to break up. And it's funny because you don't actually see
them break up.
You don't actually see a breakup scene.
Yeah.
You do see that clearly, like both of them are pretty unhappy people.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you never get that resolution. This movie is full of like lack of resolution.
Yes.
In fact, the ending is like everything is uncertain. You don't totally know what's going on. You can develop theories, like, which is why we both have these we have these theories that are reflective of our own experiences.
Right.
Which is probably the whole point, is for him to be like, here's a weird, like, funhouse mirror of what I think these moments before death, or like these subconscious collections of memories are like. And then you're going to look at it and see whatever your brain assembles from the shards.
Yeah, the nice thing about a movie that's highly symbolic and doesn't resolve a lot of its issues is that it functions as, like a Rorschach test. Like you're going to relate to this movie whether you want to or not. Whether you've been to, everyone's been to an awkward family dinner that and like this. I mean, the awkwardness is dialed way up in this movie.
It's palpable.
It's palpable,
and that's I think why you've got a pretty low audience score. It's tough to sit through some of these scenes. You just feel physically uncomfortable because you've been there, or you just have enough empathy where you're like, oh fuck, I would run.
Oh my God.
I would run.
Well, and it comes from both directions too, because it's not just the parents. You have Toni Collette asking questions that are not awkward, and then Jake just being mad about them, or like I feel like he's really ornery for a lot of that table conversation. He's moody,
Judy,
and like there's not a lot of reasoning given behind it. I mean, she's trying to play the kind of welcoming mother to Lucy, and she wants to know more about Lucy, Lucinda, etc. Again,
because they're meeting for the first time.
They're meeting for the first time while she's thinking about breaking up with Jake, and there's no way to make that conversation comfortable because you're trying to be open about with this person's parents that you're probably not going to see again, and you can't just get up and walk out. Another recurring like topic of conversation they say throughout the beginning of this movie when they're still at Jake's parents' house is she wants to leave because she has to work early the next day, and Jake keeps repeating, "I've got chains." And what that means in the context of the movie is that he's gonna wrap chains.
Snow tire chains.
He's got snow tire chains, but you know that works on the other level of like, no, I'm chaining us to this right now. Like we're not leaving because there's I'm creating a physical barrier from us doing that, and you know that's him allowing her to leave, right? Like she can't go out and take the car and just drive away, right? But she very clearly wants to leave through much of the beginning of this movie when they're still at Jake's house, but they're not at Jake's parents' house the entire time. There's some other pretty surrealist images we see throughout the movie. I think the one that we talked about this a little bit before this podcast, but the one that sticks out to me is that there's like an ice cream store in the context of this universe that they pass it on the way to Jake's parents' house, and it becomes this thing that they need to go to on the way from Jake's parents' house. And Tulsi's ice cream, I think, is what it's called or something. It's not a real ice cream chain, which is interesting because in the book they called it Dairy Queen, and I think in the movie they're just trying to remove any semblance of anchoring it to the real world.
Yeah, that was too real.
It was too real, and I think it's just because like that Dairy Queen is a thing that exists in our real world, and like creating a fake ice cream franchise allowed them to make that just bizarre but also very on point commercial.
You see a little commercial for it.
Yeah,
it's very like trippy 1930s or 40s animation.
Yeah. Like this was made when Mickey Mouse was cutting edge animation.
Yeah, for sure. Really interesting. Dreamy and surreal, and also it presents the fact that getting a sweet ice cream treat will just fix every problem that you have. And I think that's intentional because this movie has a lot of the characters looking for answers on how to be satisfied when presented with the specter of their own deaths. And, you know, the message of the movie is that there isn't any. Like, you're going to die whether you're satisfied when you die or not. Yeah. And I think, you know, creating this fantastical commercial just allows them to have a contrast to their relationship, which is so like, how do I get out of this? You know, our relationship is a physical pit right now that both of us are reluctant to climb out of, but both of us understand that we need to. And, you know, you contrast that with this I don't know if Jake understands that. I think he idolized her.
Yeah.
That's why she has all these different amazing occupations, and her, you know, she's adorable. The actress who plays her, her outfit subtly changes throughout
I think her hair does a few times too.
Her hair changes a little bit. There are all these little like misrememberings, but she's always remembered, I think, in a good light. Yeah. I think she's the one that got away.
Yes.
And his subconscious has just chewed the cud of this person and the memory of her a lot. And I think, like, in terms of those fork in the road moments, if you're like someone who's not depressed, you like years after look back on those moments and you're like, no, that happened for a reason. I'm on the right path. My life is good, blah, blah, blah. But if you're not a happy person, or at least a balanced person, you look back on those fork moments and you're like, that's the moment I lost it.
Right.
When I lost my potential happiness. Right. And it's all her fault, or it's all that situation's fault. So I'm going to chew this situation. I'm going to think about it every night before I go to bed. And I'm going to change the details so slightly. I'm going to have a different fantasy conversation about us in the car each time. They have these amazing academic fantasy conversations on the drive to the parents' house each time. And some of them are clearly the kind of conversation that you only have in your brain, where she has a great point, he has a great point, the witty banter is on point. Like, you have these moments where it's like, okay, this is clearly scripted, or they're not even pretending to be natural human beings talking in a car. It's too perfect. They're both too smart, too well prepared for this conversation about a movie or about a poem or whatever.
Oh, I was gonna say, speaking of well prepared, he perfectly recites a poem from Wordsworth.
That's a fantasy.
That is long. That's a fantasy. You don't do that spontaneously and drive when it's snowing dangerously. And then her counter to that is that she recites a poem that she wrote that is also amazing. The poem is really, really good.
It's good. It's dark though.
Well, it is dark, but my point being that, like, it's perfection bouncing against perfection in what is a memory, not real life.
Yeah, he pressures her. It's a poem she wrote in the book. In the movie, I imagine Charlie Kaufman must have written this poem for the character, which is impressive. But it's great. She somehow has it memorized, even though she wrote it I think recently in the universe. But it is a perfect
in the Hereditary universe.
long, interesting, and very nuanced poem that she just kind of spits out during the road trip scenes, and that's kind of it's a fantasy. It's clearly a remembrance of something that was perfect that probably wasn't when it really happened. If it did really happen, that's the thing.
If it did, and there's certain points when they're at Jake's parents' house that I think her status starts declining. Right, like in the car, she's I think getting her PhD in again neurobiology, and then there's a point in Jake's parents' house where like her career starts becoming less important. Like I think at one point she talks about like just. She's a high school teacher that never made it farther in college or something. Like the way that he remembers her begins declining, and either that may line up with reality or that might be him trying to reassure himself that what you lost wasn't actually that godlike or divine or powerful.
Or just the way you temper you're thinking about someone and you're like, that's not really how it was. Yeah. Like it's him tempering or maybe trying to course correct. The thoughts he has about this person.
Right.
The whole movie isn't just about them, though. I mean, I think that the breakup is that pivotal thing for him, that fork in the road. But other parts of his life kind of seep into the movie in some interesting ways. He works at a high school as a janitor. And I think it's the high school he went to as a child as well. Because you kind of have memories of him going to high school and dealing with probably what was a slight mental disability or whatever weirdness this guy had. He's got like traumatic memories of being a kid at this high school, and then he's a janitor at this high school who's just kind of like looking on as generation after class after class of kids come through. And I think that the story with the school is that like every class of kids is the same fucking group of kids, that the different archetypes just reproduce themselves. Like there's always the sort of skinny, hot, mean blonde girls in every class.
Right.
And they work at the Dairy Queen or the ice cream shop, and they're mean to him there. And you can't quite tell if they're being mean to adult Jake or like teenage Jake. And then they're mean to him as a janitor, like the same girls, but they're like reproductions of the same archetype of high school girl are mean to him throughout his whole life, which I found really interesting because you see them in these different places. And then the musical Oklahoma is featured. I haven't seen this musical.
Highly prominently, and I've also
clearly there's some extra subtext there. I don't know what it is. Clearly there's something about Oklahoma that he thought was just a great blend with this. I mean, maybe it takes place in Oklahoma.
That's
I think
possible.
Parts of Oklahoma get pretty snowy. It's just a flat, kind of barren Midwestern landscape we're looking at here.
I haven't seen Oklahoma, but I don't know if it matters. I mean, maybe if I read the Wikipedia on Oklahoma, my interpretation of this will differ, but I don't know if it matters what musical it was, because in the beginning of the movie, when he's talking to the girlfriend, I'm just going to call her that because her name changes throughout the movie, he mentions a line from Oklahoma, and she, her response is, "Oh, I didn't know you liked musicals." And he goes, I don't really like musicals, but that musical just always stuck for me. And then when he's a janitor, we see the kids are preparing for the movie, are rehearsing Oklahoma. And I think that's just another relic of him being trapped in this high school, right? That he...
the story, too, I think Oklahoma is about a courtship, like a young woman breaking up with someone. And I think it's like a love triangle in this musical. I don't remember.
Well, and that's where I could have been more prepared.
So it could be a little bit more of a reflection of how he feels about this Lucy girl. Right. Maybe. I don't know.
But regardless, it still just goes back to like he's trapped in this high school. This is the movie telling you that he's trapped in this high school, where he's remarking about it in his memory. And then when we see Janitor Jake, he sees all of these children with all of this potential preparing for the same musical that I think it's implied that he did when he was in high school. And it just shows
wanted to do.
But like all of these children have the potential of not being trapped in the loop that he is, right? Like all of these children can never come back.
I think Oklahoma is a loop. Like it's done over and over again by high schools. It's very nostalgic. It's very like PG and dated. I mean,
it comes from the time when everything on TV was a Western, or like when Green Acres was like the #1 channel on TV.
It's possible Kaufman is trying to give us some commentary about the tropes inside of it that I'm not picking up on because I haven't seen it.
Right.
But this idea of the dated reproduction, right?
Exactly.
The idea of archetypes happening over and over again, because that's kind of what's going on in the high school.
Right.
That's what's going on when we keep revisiting scenes where it's like, did we already see them eat dinner? Didn't we already see her serve this dish? But it's just slightly tweaked. Like he's remembering, he's reproducing memories, right? So I think that's a theme as well, like reproducing feelings. Like when you go to Dairy Queen, you're reproducing feelings of nostalgia that you probably felt when you were a child and you went to Dairy Queen and it was awesome. It was like the ultimate fulfillment when you were a certain age.
We should state that we're not sponsored by Dairy Queen, but Shannon is a big fan of soft serve ice cream. She's vanilla soft serve in my phone. So there's that. I mean, I don't know if Charlie Kaufman is applying that to everyone, but I think he's talking about the nostalgia of like
this relationship with like sweet and ultimately non-nutritious things. Like Oklahoma is sweet. It's kind of a throwaway. I don't think it's necessarily the pillar of American culture,
right?
Even though we're teaching it to every high school student.
Well, we're teaching it to high school students because they can be trusted with it, right? Like I don't know how complicated the music in Oklahoma is, but like you give high school students stuff that high school students, teenagers that haven't been training for as many years as like a professional in their mid-20s can do.
Yeah. And maybe it's a crowd pleaser in the sense that like parents are willing to watch it again and again because it's easy. It goes down.
Right.
Goes down nice and smooth.
But I think going back to other themes that are presented in this movie, we hear this story in the beginning of this movie where Jake's parents own a farm. We talked about how this is a rural part of some cold and snowy state, and he takes her into the barn kind of against his girlfriend's will, right? Like she didn't really want to go into the barn in the beginning of the movie. She's just kind of doing what he says because there's nothing else to do. There's nothing around. It's just this bleak, snowy landscape for miles around the barn.
Well, she doesn't want to be rude. Like the mom's already waving at them through the window from upstairs. It's weird.
And they don't go into the house right away. Like when they get to the house, the mom is waving and Jake takes her into the barn instead of going directly into the house.
Yeah.
And he tells her this story of how they used to keep pigs, but they don't anymore. And the reason they don't keep pigs is because the last time they had pigs, the father fed them and then they left somewhere over the weekend where they weren't really keeping an eye on the pigs. And when they came back, the pigs were wallowing in only one part of the pen. And then it took them a few days to realize that the pigs were actually being eaten by maggots from underneath. And it's definitely like the most disturbing image in this entire movie, I would say, where it just evokes this idea of being eaten alive. Like you're alive, but you're also being confronted by something that is killing you slowly. And I think that also plays into some of the fear that we see in the beginning of this movie. Like this relationship is kind of eating him alive, right? And it's something that has been...
Or is it eating her alive?
Well, I think
she's the one who's thinking about anything.
She's the one who's thinking about ending things, but the breakup really kind of prevents him from ever growing as a person right up until his death, right? Like he's thinking about this breakup for the rest of his life.
Yes.
It's eating him alive because
the memory is.
The memory.
Not the relationship.
No.
I think too, like that's one of the first I don't know how many acts or whatever are in this film, but you've got the first drive. They drive through a light blizzard to get to the parents' house. They finally arrive at the parents' house, and then you get this pig story.
Yeah.
So I think like you're waiting for the action to start a lot. Like it's a long drive. They talk about a lot of different things. Some of the conversations are great. Some of the conversations are like, ooh, these people are in trouble.
Yeah. these people should not be together.
You shouldn't be together. Yep. Yeah. And then you finally get somewhere, and it's this beautiful little farm, and you're like, okay, sweet, something's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then it's like death immediately.
Yeah, immediately.
And I think that's him sort of subverting some expectations of like, oh, you're here to like meet the family and have a meal, and like it's going to be cozy, and then it's not.
Yeah, before any of that, you're just met with this like disgusting, horrifying image.
Yeah. And like, I think the idea of death is like sprinkled throughout the movie, and he just folds it in when he can, and that's a big one, is like this weird pig death story.
Yeah.
And then later they're served pig at the dinner table.
Yeah. Well, that was another thing, because they stated that we only serve food that we grew here at the farm.
Yep.
And then like right after this story of the pig being eaten alive, she brings out a ham. It's like, oh God.
Yeah.
Hope you served the back part of that or something.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the movie, the janitor, you know, again, this janitor is never named as Jake, but it's heavily implied that he is the janitor.
You have some clues. The girlfriend goes down to change the laundry for the mom at one point, and
sees
all the laundry are janitor uniforms, which is funny. Because you kind of think she's going to learn some dirty secret.
Yeah, because the basement is presented in horror movie fashion of like, don't go down there.
Yeah, all of the horror tropes are used. The scary music, that don't go down there, all of it.
There's like claw marks on the door.
Yeah, they do all this stuff. Yeah. The dirty secret, the horror, is that he's a janitor.
Right.
He didn't go anywhere. He didn't amount to anything, which is really funny, or like really real.
Yeah.
That's scarier than any monster, is the idea that the woman you loved knows you're kind of this failure.
Right.
And you ended up kind of alone and didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
That's his horror.
She's discovering a part of you that you were really trying to keep in.
You know, you're glad she doesn't know, or you would never want her to find out.
Right. And even if she does know, I think it's less about his like occupation at the time and more about the occupation for the rest of his life. Like if we're really seeing this through a memory, I think it's the remembered girlfriend realizing that he doesn't have the potential to like grow outside of himself, and he will be trapped in this sad, limited expression of himself for the rest of his life. It's more like her like seeing into the future and like this is all that he ever is, and I think that's what's horrifying to him. That thought. Yeah, sure, totally. But in going back to the pig, at the end of the movie, we see the actual janitor, who is never named, hallucinating this pig that Jake talked about in the before times. And this pig, so the janitor undresses. He's completely naked when he walks back into the high school in this scene that we see him in, and he's hallucinating the pig leading him through the high school. So we have this naked janitor who has a pig walking in front of him because this movie didn't want to have the scene of this guy's dick, I'm assuming, walking through this high school at night. But it is rated R. It is right. That's true. I mean, it's Netflix. Like they could certainly do that. But I think the metaphor is more that like you're walking into your death, kind of the way that you were born. You're completely naked. You're stripped of anything that could protect you. You're not even necessarily wearing your uniform anymore, which, you know, either your janitor uniform or the uniform of your personality and your accomplishments and who you are as you walk into death. Your money. Or lack thereof. Right. And you're walking into your death the same way that this pig accepted it, just wallowing and waiting. Like you've kind of known about this for a while. But I do want to talk about the last scene of this movie too, which is interesting because it's of him getting, I believe, a non-specified Nobel Prize. Like they don't tell you what he's getting the Nobel Prize. I think you assume it might be the Peace Prize because that's sort of the big one, but I mean, don't know. It's the idea that there's an award ceremony for Jake, who is dressed up. You know, he's aged, and Jesse Plemons is aged. He's not the janitor. He's an aged version of Jesse Plemons with white hair and makeup Jake on him. Yeah. And this is the Jesse Plemons or Jake, I should say, that he wanted to be. That there's an award ceremony for him. There are people here celebrating his accomplishments that he could have done. And it's like in the same auditorium that he's watching the kids practice or like rehearse Oklahoma in, right? Which is really interesting. Like there's this whole relationship between like him viewing kids living their lives and creating memorable scenes. He's kind of a spectator in his life a lot, and then this is like that dream reversal of that where he's on stage for whatever unnamed reason, because he's great. Right. It's just so triumphant and so like against the rest of the movie. Like it really clashes.
No, it's another fantasy.
It's a fantasy. It's something that's so obviously like this isn't happening that it really, it's, I'm not going to say it's funny at the end of the movie, but it's just, it shows you the self that Jake imagines he could have been. Right. Like he spends this movie as a janitor seeing all these kids go through the high school with all this potential. And in his mind, the potential is still there, like right before he dies. Right.
Yeah. I think what you said about like the waiting, like the pigs waiting for the maggots to just sort of take them.
Yeah.
And then in the title of the movie itself, you have I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which is about a waiting period where you're like, I don't know if it's the time. Is this weekend the time?
Yeah.
Should I do it after the dinner? I met his parents. Like, no, you shouldn't have done it earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
But, this idea of waiting, and I think again and again about dreaming and about when you're falling asleep after like a stressful day, you have these like negative thoughts that will pop up. But right before you go to sleep, you're like, no, I gotta dream about something good. I gotta think about whatever it is. Maybe I fantasize about winning the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a pleasant thought to put yourself at ease before you succumb to sleep. And I think if you're conscious enough, in the moments before death, you might do the same thing.
Yeah.
You might say like, okay, I've been thinking about this breakup and this girl for 15 minutes now, and I'm sitting here waiting. I'm in the waiting room, kind of just fading. We don't know how the janitor or Jake or the amalgamation of those people, how they die, but clearly there's this period of like maybe they took pills and they were waiting for them to kick in, or they froze to death because there is all this blizzard.
I think the freezing to death is something
in the truck.
Might be because
I think he froze to death in his truck, maybe, and that would take forever. That's a really long way to die. But you would also dream because you might fall asleep first. You would lose consciousness first.
Yeah, and you're dreaming while your body is freezing to death.
But I definitely think that we have these tonal derivatives. Like we are just, it's all over the place tonally. Yeah. I think because that is how my brain is before I fall asleep, especially if I have like a negative mental day where I have plenty of negative things to think about. I'm constantly being like, no. Let's think about beaches, or let's think about, a vacation or a good thing, or don't think about that breakup because that's going to lead you to having a bad dream.
Right.
So I think maybe he's course correcting his own thoughts in the way that a sort of half-conscious person can do.
Yeah.
Which would explain, I think that's how I perceive just the way like, oh, we're dancing now, and now we're not dancing, and we're at the high school, but it's also the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. Like, we're in this place and we're at that, like the way that time and space is just scrunched up into a ball, into a very like, a ball without a lot of logic is very like semi-dream logic, I think.
I think that also ties into the fact that the literal events that lead us to the high school at the end of the movie they're coming from this not Dairy Queen restaurant where Jake is just humiliated by these teenage girls working at an ice cream parlor. Like he wants the ice cream really badly, but he will not.
They don't really eat it.
Well, yeah, he takes like 2 bites and then throws it away. But he gives his girlfriend.
That might be a huge symbol of some kind.
It's something I want
to buy an expensive, or not an expensive, but like
it's time expensive.
Fancy ice cream. Yeah. Take 2 bites of it and then just discard it.
It's too sweet for me.
I don't know.
I think. Well, I think the point of him being humiliated is that it reminds past Jake, remember Jake, of how current Jake feels by these people. I don't know if past Jake would actually be too humiliated to go pay for ice cream by himself, but I think present Jake would, and I think that's why in his mind he gives his girlfriend the money. But,
I would caution you against saying things like past Jake and present Jake, because I really do think that like it's just Jake.
Well, remember young Jake.
Yes, there's youthful body
young
Jake.
Y-U-N-G, young Jake. Yeah. But yeah, I guess past and present is the way to talk about it. It's remembered Jake.
Yes,
it's remembered. How you remember and how dying Jake feels.
Right.
But so the events that lead up to this. And how his
subconscious is sort of like projecting, right?
It's it's projecting backwards in like actual memories that happen. But the events that take place is that they leave this not Dairy Queen. Jake takes 2 bites of the ice cream that he was really intent on getting, and then just said, oh, this is too sweet for me. I want to throw it away. So they need somewhere to throw it away, and they pass the high school that he went to, and they go into the parking lot and they throw it away. and he and his girlfriend briefly kiss, and remembered Jake sees the janitor watching them, and he gets out of the car and he says like, I'm gonna go track him down. And Lucinda is left in the car by herself. She's getting bored. She doesn't have a phone, which I think one thing, the phone is also an image present throughout this movie that I want to talk about
before we move on to the phone, I think perhaps the ice cream could be an allegory for like what life is like as a depressed person. Like you have the desire. The desire is big to get the ice cream, to feel happy, to have sweet, wonderful things in your life. But then once you get there, there's no enjoyment and you discard that thing immediately.
You're not able to enjoy the thing that you're trying to get to.
People who just don't have the, I don't know, some sort of imbalance. And
I mean, you say people, like I definitely relate to this. I've been diagnosed with depression, and it is harder for me to, I know that I'm not getting the same neurochemical reactions to things that some people
that other people are. Right. And there's all of this focus on the ice cream itself and getting there. And like he goes way out of their way to get to this ice cream shop, and he's thinking about it, and he's telling her about how good it is.
He notes it on the way up to the cabin or up to the
he's talking about it, and like he spends all this time thinking about the ice cream and then spends like literally 30 seconds eating it. Doesn't enjoy it, and then
discards
and then goes on another detour to discard the cups because he doesn't want them to like mess up his car. Like he doesn't want his cup holders to get sticky, which is a really dark interpretation of how some people, no matter how sweet no matter how many sweet things are in your hands in your life, how if you do not have the capacity to enjoy them, you'll just be chasing the white rabbit, the soft serve rabbit your entire life, which is like, oh, so dark. But I bet really relatable. Not something I totally relate to, but I can see the allegory in that, which is interesting. Okay, let's move on to the phone.
Okay, so the phone thing is what really first tipped me off to the fact that the Jake that we're seeing in his parents' house is some past form of himself, right? Because so the girlfriend is the only one with a phone. No one else has a smartphone in this house but the girlfriend.
Or we don't see him.
Well, we don't see him. We're only shown the phone of the girlfriend. And when people are calling her, different people are calling her. And the way that her phone rings is how like an old like dial phone rings, right? Like it doesn't vibrate. It doesn't have like a modern ringtone. It very intentionally has a like ring to it from like, you know, like how a circular phone used to. And I think that's important because she doesn't answer her phone at any point. I think it's heavily implied that she's not actually getting phone calls. He's remembering a phone ringing, but it might not be calling to her specifically. But like that noise of the phone, like that's what a phone in like the 60s or 70s would sound like if the house was being called. And I don't think Lucy's actually being called. I think she's just ignoring him. She's
or maybe Lucy has a calling.
Yes.
And he doesn't.
Yes.
There's this sort of idea of like people who feel like if you know from an early age kind of what you're supposed to do with your life, you're sort of blessed in this way that other people aren't. Where you kind of have this thing that'll always lead you to success, to happiness, to fulfillment, like whatever it is. And I think this is reading into it pretty deeply, but like Lucy having a calling, like she has all these occupations throughout, and they're all really interesting, fascinating occupations that they talk about. And then the parents ask her about different aspects of it. And you just get the sense that this Lucy character, this girl who breaks up with him, was going places and had a bright future ahead of her. And that shows up, that bubbles up into the narrative in some interesting ways, including, I think, the phone.
Well, and she specifically doesn't answer the phone. She's not answering her calling while she's with him.
Yeah. Right? Ooh, that's definitely double. Yeah, that's quite the dark. Like I was holding her back from success.
And both of them knew that. I think that's why earlier I said that their relationship was a pit, and both of them know that they're in something that
he knows he's holding her back.
He knows he's holding her back, and he knows that she's never going to be satisfied while they're together.
Yeah. It is a psychological horror.
Yeah, isn't it? It's very heavy on the psychological part because it's not. I think when I think like psychological horror, there are a lot of other movies. Like Shutter Island is probably a more standard definition of psychological horror. Where like, I didn't think that movie was amazing, but it is a movie about, you know, someone's perceptions being shifted around until, you know, they're in the asylum that they were sent to investigate. Yeah. Spoiler alert. But that's what I generally consider about psychological horror. But this is psychological, relatable horror. This is something that
I think
happens every day without involving a conspiracy or anything. Like this is actually this is the mundane banality of not necessarily evil, but just life. Just feeling unsatisfied and knowing that you could have done more with your life and you don't have any more time. Your time's up. You're now that pig that was getting eaten alive by maggots, and you are, you know, a few chunks of flesh away from, you know.
Yeah. You have these moments in like the history of horror films where like early horror films, the threat is always external.
Yeah.
And it's usually kind of coded anti-commie.
Yeah.
Them. It's them against us.
You said there's a movie called Them that's about a race of like alien ants coming for us. And it's about
alien threats.
Yeah, right.
It's always pure and good humans against external monsters. That's kind of like,
and in Them, it's a metaphor for Chinese communists. Sure, because there's so many.
Whatever the metaphor, but that's kind of like early horror films. Yes. And then you start getting the call's coming from inside the house kind of stuff. Where there's like the Blair Witch Project, which is about
I think you could even go
realism in the expression of how the film, like Blair Witch Project, freaked people out because it felt so real in the way that it was filmed. Yeah. And so that's like this tantamount moment in horror film history where it's like things got a little closer to the ground, a little closer to our actual lives, and that made it scarier.
I'd argue that goes back to Hitchcock.
There's a ton of plot points. I'm not a horror film buff by any means, but I think that you could argue this is just a plot point on that timeline, maybe ahead of its time, in terms of like the call is coming from inside the house. Like the threat is you. The threat is your own neurochemical balance that haunts you.
Yeah.
Your own perception of your life.
You're trapped in the prison of your own mind.
You're trapped, yes. Or you're trapped in the prison of your own like expectations for your life and the way that you dealt with when life didn't need them.
Right.
Like your choices about life letting you down are horrific. Right. In this guy's case.
And that's something that I think
he let all this shit happen to him. He let himself believe he was holding her back instead of, taking certain actions, which I know is difficult when you're depressed, taking certain actions to change the course of like how you perceive yourself or how you think your girlfriend perceives you. That is very difficult. Totally get it. But, he is his own worst enemy. Well, and he's the threat.
He's the threat. He's his own worst enemy because he's also incapable of enjoying anything. Because I don't want to make this podcast to sound like we're saying that being a janitor is not a less than desirable career. Like he thought he could do more, but he's also living in a first world country where we don't see really any bad things happen to him outside of his parents dying, which happens to all humans, and he's unable to enjoy the life that he's living. If you're a janitor in a rural setting, you have some standard of living. You are fed. I
think it's implied he lives at his parents' house as a janitor.
He does. He lives at his parents' house, but he has their safety. He has their shelter. Totally. Like as a living being, he's able to live without fear of, being fired or the ground being the rug being pulled out.
It's a kind of life that I think a healthy person would find enjoyment from
or comfort, and he doesn't find any comfort,
or at least it's not reflected in this narrative, which is not the entire. It's not the entirety of someone's life. It's just kind of what bubbled up in those final moments, perhaps.
Yeah,
that's my theory anyway. But it's notable too, as a janitor, he hangs out in this like break room, like the teacher's lounge probably is what this room is, and he watches television.
Yeah.
And we come back to him a few times watching something. That's where I think we learn about the commercial for the ice cream place. So he's watching TV, and then he's watching like a soap or something.
Yeah,
I don't remember.
There's some sequence of events where we see the janitor watching something on TV, and then later on Lucy is doing that career, or like her name changes to something that the janitor watched. Like,
that's why I think about dreams a lot watching this movie, because dreams are like, you take these random ingredients from like a movie you saw, a conversation you have with your boss, your boyfriend's face, and then like a meal you maybe prepared. Like your brain takes these different ingredients and mixes them up in these kind of odd ways where it's like, oh, it was the plot line from my favorite book, plus what I ate for dinner, plus the underlying feelings I have about whatever, like some breakup or whatever it is. Like, and not all of us have time to process that or even remember that dream.
Or the ability to remember that.
But I feel like Kaufman is definitely, I would bet money on the fact that he's someone who remembers his dreams, because he's doing a very deft job at combining elements from the reality into dream sequences. Like, I think, because it's just stuff that I've been like, oh yeah, I've had that happen to me, where a random television show episode I watched popped up in a weird way.
Right.
In my dream.
And I think that's generally how dreams work, and we acknowledge that. But I wanted to say, so we have this movie that describes how a character that describes a character's self-esteem and wants and desires that are beyond them. That most of this is told to us. Expectations.
That's what TV is.
How do you compare this movie to Mulholland Drive? Because I would argue they're horrifying in the exact same ways. That it's about a character who hasn't achieved the potential that they want to in real life.
Salty.
So that they're salty about it. The difference is, I think, that in Mulholland Drive, the dream of Camilla is that she actually is more successful. Whereas I think this movie is much more bleak, where he's not able to really imagine himself as something better beyond one scene we're given at the very end.
The Nobel Prize.
Like, this guy is so...
I think the scenes, the good conversations we have in the car, I think those are also scenes where he's like, if I had only said that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think those were conversations that didn't go as well in real life.
Yeah.
And that he is amending. Like, you know how you might have, in France, they call this the spirit of the stairwell, which is this, when you're often gifted the great comeback or the great insight.
Like a minute after.
As you're leaving, you're going downstairs to leave the apartment that you were talking to someone in. It's called the spirit of the stairwell. They have a great little phrase for it.
In Seinfeld studies, we call that the jerk store. There's the episode where George spends an entire episode coming up with a comeback that he should have said in a meeting.
Scene before.
The scene before it.
So people, I do this sometimes. I'll amend conversations I had with better insights or funnier jokes or whatever. I'll like replay it. Often as I'm laying in bed that day, like, I should have said this. I should have said this when my boss said that. Or I should have said this in the brainstorm. And I think that there's a ton of dialogue. They spent a lot of time in the car talking, the two of them. And I think quite a bit of that is him amending conversations that they maybe had.
Yeah, because it's too
when they were together. Like the perfection of that is just unreal.
Especially contrasted to what else we see in the movie.
And I think it's him kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel for like, what could I have said? Like, you know, like people who are heartbroken, you spend hours thinking about like, what could I have said? What could I have done? Who could I have been to have made this person want to stay with me? Like you think about that a lot. And he's had, I think, probably years and years and years to think about that.
With really nothing else.
It's sort of implied that this was his last relationship ever. But
and there's probably 30 years between this relationship and like when we see the janitor dying.
Yeah, because I mean, he looks to be late 70s, early 80s.
Yep.
And I mean, he's probably late 70s because people are usually retired by then. I mean, I don't know if janitors are, but...
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's implied that like whether he could retire or not, this is just what he does because he's not going to
occupy himself.
To occupy himself.
Yeah, that's true. Where was I going? Oh, yeah, the woulda, coulda, shouldas.
Yeah.
Is something that comes up in dreams all the time, and I think is happening a lot in this movie. Is like woulda, coulda, shoulda said, felt, whatever. And then it's mixed in with the dark realities of what actually happened. And then also the even darker perceptions of how he perceives it in his like kind of probably depressed psyche.
Yeah.
Of like, there's nothing worse than how if you're sad or depressed, there's nothing like the reality that exists in your brain is often darker than the reality that exists in the world around you.
And the narrative is going to be
it's your perception that's dark.
Yeah, the events of your life are going to feed into the narrative that you tell about yourself until it gets darker and darker and darker. Like you're going to be spiraling downward for, and it's implied, the rest of his life.
Yeah, and that's how you get this tonal. It's like a something a bunch of truths put in a blender.
Yeah, different
truths and untruths and perceptions of how things were. And maybe I don't know if Kaufman has this in mind at all, but like the movie, thinking about it, reminds me that there is no such thing as this certain truth. There is no such thing as this was a good time or this was a bad time. There's only how you tell it in your brain, your perceptions, and your memories of that thing.
And that's why
you're in control of that.
Yes.
And you're kind of not in control of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, to some extent.
Your subconscious can run with it.
That's why I want to read the book after seeing this movie and knowing that the book actually does clarify at the end that the janitor is Jake. This movie never tells you that. This movie is never explicit about saying these are the same person. It's heavily implied, but the book supposedly, from what I've read on Wikipedia, so great source material, is that it does clarify that Jake, A, dropped out of college at one point, and B, is dissatisfied his entire life, and C, is the janitor at the end of the movie. Yeah. And I think the movie wins a lot of points in my mind for being more vague because it allows more of an interpretation for every viewer of what this movie actually is saying. It's the Rorschach thing. It allows people to connect with this and think about the story that it's telling about regret, and it's telling you that you can't go back in time, right? Like it's that Brigadoon message of like, you can never go home again. You can never change the past, and you're only in control of how you...
If you think about her poem and what that says, that you can go back, but there's only bad things there. There's only depression there.
There's only depression and bleakness if you spend your life dwelling on the past.
And editing.
Right.
Editing every little thing you said. It's just not... It's not productive, and it's not nutritious, just like that ice cream thing with you have the desire to do this thing, but don't, because it's empty. You're not going to feel pleasure there.
Right.
You're going to discard it.
Yeah. And when this movie is literally about him going back to his parents' house in the beginning, I think it's just, it kind of describes the toxic mentality of trying to revisit your past and the futility of doing that. If anything, this movie is an argument for like doing something with your life and just finding something that fulfills you and working toward it. Because if you don't do that, you're going to be Jake. You're going to be on your deathbed, cold, frozen, and alone, filled with regret. I think that's kind of what this movie is arguing.
And salt, so much salt. He is really bitter about the things that could have been, things he could have said.
And when we talk about bitterness, there's a point at his parents' house where his mom is going over the awards that you win in high school or middle school that are meaningless as an adult. She's basically coming up with the fact that the only good thing I can say about Jake now is that he won some permanent record award in school that will never affect the rest of your life. And she gets it wrong in his mind. Like she thought that he won like best student or best attendance or something
like that.
And he goes like, no, I actually won Diligent, which was an also ran award. And like, he's so salty about this award that will never make any difference on the rest of his life, but those are the only good things you can say. These are the only accomplishments that you have, so you have to place an undue amount of importance on them.
Sure. Or he does. He chose to. His consciousness chose to.
He's so specific about, no, I won Diligent, which was an also ran award, and like, that is a level of importance that a middle school, high school award has on your life that is probably unrealistic or just confusing to someone, because it shows you that you really don't value yourself after a certain point in time.
We could unpack this film for probably hours and hours, but we're over an hour here, so let's wrap it up with final verdicts. Tim, what's your final verdict? Do you recommend this film?
I would definitely recommend this movie, and I would recommend it to everyone, despite the very low audience score. I think it's pretty clear why this movie has a low audience score and a high critic score because this movie is labeled a psychological horror, and I think if you're going out for a slasher movie, you're not going to just be disappointed, you're going to be very mad at this movie. I've recommended the movie Mandy to a lot of people that like horror and just did not like how slow the entrance was, and I don't care what those people think, they're wrong. So I would recommend this movie to everyone, and if you don't like it, I consider you wrong.
My final verdict is similar. Stick it out. This movie kind of reminds me of, I read Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison this summer, and it's a similar thing where like, you sit through some really uncomfortable scenes, and she's building this uncomfortable, awful case about how terrible certain characters are, but then in the long run it's so meaningful because she shows that she kind of flips the coin over and she shows you here's how things really truly are, and she reminds you in the process of doing that you're constantly building biased narratives about the world around you all the time based on your experiences. She only shows you a sliver of who this person is, and then it purposefully shows you a different sliver of who that person is to fuck with your perception of that person on purpose. And the whole point is, I think she was a lawyer in a past life. The whole point is to show you just how biased your consciousness is, just how biased your narrative and your recounting of events is. Even if you were just a passive reader who was reading what she meant for you to read, right? And Kaufman's kind of similar here, where there is no unreliable narrator, there is no narrator. Yeah. It's just a blender full of scraps of remembered and fantastic
events,
thoughts.
Yeah, thoughts.
It is a blend. It's a smoothie of thoughts. My verdict is just like Tim said. Definitely watch this film. Stick it out. It'll be uncomfortable in certain scenes, but it's all worth it in the end, just like a good novel can be.
I will also say I don't think there were many scenes where I personally wasn't comfortable.
Oh, it's so cringe. I cringed a lot. But maybe there's a gender thing there where she is the uncomfortable girlfriend in a lot of these scenes, and maybe I just related to that.
You might relate to that more. Have you ever seen the movie Mother by Aronofsky?
No, but that's the one where Aronofsky and
Jennifer Lawrence.
They got together when they did. That's when they were dating.
Yeah,
right?
Aronofsky is not in that movie, but the movie is about a director dating a much younger woman, right. Jennifer Lawrence. And that movie has a point in it that I related to in The Cringe, which is where there's a ton of people in her house that she wants gone, but someone else in her house invited them there, so she can't tell them.
Oh, that's really relatable.
And I think that's kind of what you're getting on, where like your personal experience will determine how much this movie makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah, totally.
Because I have dealt with depression for my entire life, and I found this movie, I understood it, but I wasn't uncomfortable.
That might be built in how much cringy, how cringy I felt, because I was like, ooh, I understand that this is very much someone's real experience, and it's just not. It's not mine.
And for me, this is like, I've dealt with this before.
Right.
You know,
it's more it's more mundane and banal for you, perhaps, because of that.
Exactly. But I think we both liked the movie, and again, when we started this podcast, we did not set out to have the same verdict on every movie that we watch.
I know, because we often don't.
We often don't. Going forward, we do want to have some other couples that will suggest movies externally, so it's not just us.
The call won't always come from inside the house.
The call will not always come from inside the house. I'm Tim Schumacher.
I'm Shannon Fletcher. This has been another episode of Film Lovers. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.